navigation systems and turn on the C2V2 or common communications for visiting vehicles, a comm system that links Dragon with the space station crew. The approach initiation burn moves Dragon into a spot about a quarter mile, 400 meters directly below the station. It also brings Dragon into a safety zone called the approach ellipsoid. And that is a large invisible oval around the station that measures 4 kilometers by 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers. Now, before entering the approach ellipsoid, Dragon must be on a 24-hour safe trajectory, which means if it lost control due to the thrusters, it wouldn't be able to drift into that area for at least a full day. Now, after approach initiation, which is going to be occurring in about 8.5 minutes from now, the next major milestone will be Waypoint 0. And once Dragon arrives at 400 meters below station, it'll be known as Waypoint 0, and that's where the first checkpoint will begin for our approach. Dragon Grace can hold here at the 400-meter mark. If all systems check out, it can continue to the approach to Waypoint 1, the next gate in its path. And then shortly, the NASA and SpaceX teams will do a go, no-go poll to move Dragon inside the Keepout sphere, another checkpoint that consists of an imaginary sphere around station with a radius of 200 meters. Flight controllers here on the ground use this to monitor all arriving and departing vehicles, and this is another chance to confirm that all the guidance and navigation and control systems are working correctly on Dragon Grace before moving closer to station. All of this carries a similar requirement on the orbital trajectory of Dragon, and if Dragon were to somehow lose control of its thrusters, and the space station would be safe for 4 orbits or about 6 hours rather than the 24-hour required to enter the approach ellipsoid. So as you can see on your screen, from Waypoint 0 to Waypoint 1, that's where we move to the next gate, in which Waypoint 1 will swing, the Dragon will swing up and over the International Space Station and arrive at an approximate distance of about 220 meters. At this point, it will be on what we call a docking axis. And at this point, it will be on what we call the docking axis, which essentially means it's just directly in front of the docking port for Dragon. And that's where the crew is heading to the space-facing port of station, the Node 2 Zenith port on the Harmony module. And from there, that's where Dragon will be docked for all of our crew missions. And so far, this is where one of 2 docking ports and international docking adapters are located and installed for these new commercial spacecraft flights, as well as other future spacecraft that use the International Docking Standard. As Dragon Grace and the Axiom Mission 4 crew continue to push forward and look to go right to the front step of the International Space Station, the next gate will be Waypoint 2. And once Dragon is only 2 meters away at Waypoint 2, the spacecraft focuses on aligning and fine-tuning its docking system with that international docking adapter on the International Space Station. From that point, we may hear out the call-out CHOP, which stands for Crew Hands-Off Point, and that happens a little less than 30 seconds or so before docking. And at this point, any aborts will have to be done automatically by Dragon. And then from there, it's the moment we've all been waiting for the Axiom Mission 4 team and the crew aboard the International Space Station, and that'll be the moment of contact, where the crew arrives to the space station and Dragon and the station make contact with giving us that final call and soft capture. And again, we are tracking for an approximate docking time of 5:18 a.m. Central Time, 6:18 a.m. Eastern Time. Once soft capture is made, the soft capture ring that connects the 2 will then retract until the sensors indicate it's time for the 12 hooks to drive in place to give us a hard capture and firmly secure Dragon to its new home and the space station. The Expedition 73 crew, namely Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers, aboard the International Space Station, got up earlier this morning, and they have already begun procedures to welcome the Axiom Mission 4 team, and they will manually pressurize the vestibule or area between the Dragon hatch and the station hatch. And meanwhile, the umbilicals that provide the power and communications and data connections from there are being sure to be put in place. And then it's time for leak checks and hatch opening, which we're currently lined up to come about 2 hours following the docking. And again, that docking time, 5:18 a.m. Central. When Dragon docks there, it'll be 5 spacecraft docked to the station with 11 crew members making its way on board the orbital outpost, and that'll bring the total number of visitors to the International Space Station to 288 since 1998. Many key milestones are coming up, and the crew aboard the International Space Station is looking forward to welcoming Axiom Mission 4. Of those milestones, we're continuing to monitor the approach initiation burn. And you can hear communication starting to happen between the big loop, and you'll hear it numerous times. It's coordinated ahead of this coverage, in which SpaceX and NASA teams coordinate a single line of communication for the two teams, as well as the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. Part of the procedures to reach the milestones and the 4 crew members inside Dragon, they don their launch and entry suits to provide an extra layer of protection and pressure as they get ready for all these dynamic operations, and they should be able to be seated and ready to roll for the approach initiation burn. These procedures have the crew seated in their respective seats and the umbilicals plugged in to provide cooling and communications, and the suits are worn for the most dynamic parts of Dragon's journey. As we mentioned, the approach initiation burn coming up here in just a couple of moments. So as we await for the approach initiation burn, which will be coming in just a couple of moments, let's check back in with our friends in Hawthorne.
Thank you, Joseph. As with all things in human spaceflight, every step is methodical and intentional. Reaching the International Space Station is no different. So while we wait for Dragon and the AX-4 crew's arrival at the space station, let's meet the crew on board.
Our mission commander today is Peggy Whitson of the United States. We actually don't have enough time to cover her entire resume, which is incredible, by the way. But to give you a few highlights, Peggy earned degrees in biology, chemistry, and biochemistry. She was the first female commander of the International Space Station and has spent over 675 total days in space.
Dragon on Dragon to ground. We have seat 1 in position, and seat 4 will be in a few moments.
And Peggy, I copy on Dragon to ground. Seat 1 is in position, and seat 4 is almost there. I've got a quick update for you on the big loop configuration. ISS side is troubleshooting some audio packets with the C2V2 unit that's currently active. So I'll get back to you with more words when we have next steps there.
Standing by. Thanks for the update.
So we were just in the middle of talking about our commander, Peggy Whitson, when we heard her communicating here with our crew operations resource engineer at SpaceX Mission Control, which we hear called out as CORE over the nets. So our commander there, again, who was communicating with our team, has spent 675 total days in space so far. She's about to add some more to that. But so far, she has also logged 60 hours across 10 different spacewalks. She's a 2-time commander for Axiom Space, having previously also served aboard AX-2. She was also just inducted as a member of the 2025 Astronaut Hall of Fame class. So congratulations, Commander Peggy.
And seated beside her inside Dragon is our mission pilot, Shubhanshu Shukla of India, whose call sign as a test pilot is Shuks. Representing the Indian Space Research Organization, or ISRO, Shuks is also an astronaut designate of India's inaugural human spaceflight effort, Gaganyaan, an Indian-built rocket and spacecraft. He was commissioned into the Indian Air Force Fighter Wing in 2006. He achieved the rank of Group Captain, in 2024, and has over 2,000 hours of flight experience aboard aircraft, including the Sukhoi 30, MKI, MiG-29, Jaguar, Hawk, and Antonov An-32.
Our third crew member is mission specialist Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski of Poland. He's representing the European Space Agency as a project astronaut coming from the reserve class of 2022, much like Marcus Want, who served as a mission specialist on AX-3. A scientist by trade, Sławomir has earned his Master's of Science with honors from Łódź University of Technology in 2008. He also has a Master's of Science from the Université de Nantes in France and a graduate engineering diploma from the Polytechnique Nantes in the same year. He also spent 2 years as the engineer in charge of the world-famous Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, beginning in 2018.
And rounding out this incredible crew is mission specialist Tibor Kapu of Hungary. He represents the Hungarian to Orbit Astronaut Program, or HUNOR. The program aims to send Hungarian astronauts to the International Space Station for scientific research and technological development, as well as to inspire young people. He graduated from the Budapest University of Technology and Economics, earning a degree in mechanical engineering, followed by a master's degree specializing in polymer technology. In 2023, Tibor emerged as one of 4 Hungarians selected from a pool of 247 candidates for the Hunor astronaut program. He has invested a notable amount of time in his career focused on space radiation protection while awaiting his acceptance to Hunor.
Together, they are the crew of AX-4, Axiom Space's 4th private astronaut mission to the International Space Station. This mission represents the return to spaceflight for 3 nations, but it also highlights the growing opportunities for nations and entities around the world to conduct meaningful work in low Earth orbit.
And this is an incredible crew. They have spent 10 months of training together. They reported to Houston last August and have been kind of shepherded through a variety of training efforts since then, all leading up to this moment. It has been truly an honor to see them come from different parts of the world and come together as one team.
Dragon SpaceX on Dragon Ground. The approach initiation maneuver is complete. Performance was nominal. Reminder, if the C2V2 link is lost for 10 minutes without ground action, Dragon will perform a breakout. Timers are available in your event details.
Dragon copies. Good AI, and watch for C2V2 and event details.
That's a good copy. And for another status update on the C2V2, ISS side is working a swap to C2V2 Bravo unit.
Good to hear. Thanks.
So that's great news as we continue in our approach of the Dragon spacecraft to the International Space Station. That first approach initiation burn, or the AI burn, ran nominally. And nominally in space talk means everything went well. So it means we're moving closer to that docking ceremony and welcoming the AX-4 crew on board.
I love it. And so we'll continue to listen in and in hopes that they will continue to progress towards docking. Obviously, there's a lot of action that has already taken place over the last 24 hours. And we'd love to share a little bit of that pre-flight effort with you that built up to launch and then towards docking. So yesterday, June 25th, the AX-4 crew was driven from quarantine to Kennedy Space Center. Here you see a photo of them at a handover event. This is a special moment where the Axiom Space Operations crew officially hands over the crew to SpaceX before they go to the Falcon Support Building to suit up. This was a moment where they got to spend a few minutes with their loved ones, with family and friends, and pause in the midst of all the operational choreography and just take in a moment about what they were about to do and to celebrate it and enjoy just this moment with loved ones. And then as this concluded, they got into the SpaceX Teslas that took them out to the Falcon Support Building, at which point they were officially in the hands of SpaceX.
I always think these walkout moments are so cool. Human spaceflight is really about the people on board and the people behind them. And you get this great opportunity to see their families, their friends, all the teams supporting them from around the world. Speaking of which, this is a little video we captured yesterday, right before our crew walked out to enter the Dragon spacecraft. There they are exiting the Falcon Support Building, which is just about a half-mile away from their launch site, which was the historic Launch Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center.
That walkout moment is so iconic. It is part of every tradition of spaceflight. I love seeing it.
So is this, actually. We've got a member of our closeout crew there with our 2 of our astronauts headed over to the pad in those 2 iconic Teslas. We've got our commander there looking very happy.
Those smiles.
Yeah, the crew getting to see Falcon 9 from the base before riding that elevator up to space. You can see we're also introducing a new tradition here. Each of our crew members has a boarding pass. Peggy's is gold because she is a frequent flyer on the Dragon spacecraft. So they're presenting those to the closeout team before signing the white room wall. And then ingressing or entering the capsule and getting ready for liftoff. We did have an on-time liftoff yesterday at 2:31 a.m. Eastern. And ever since then, so now for more than 24 hours, our AX-4 crew has been on their way to the International Space Station.
Those boarding passes, as you just mentioned, are a fun tradition that adds to the layers of...
Config, we can confirm we have intercom checks for all 4 seats now.
And Peggy, could you repeat your last?
Just wanted to verify we had successful intercom check, step 5.2, and suit donning and audio config. And we're just moving on.
Okay, I copy successful intercom checks and suit donning and audio config complete and ready to move on.
Good copy.
So you'll hear us continue to talk from mission control here at SpaceX and the big loop, right? We've got NASA in the loop now too as we approach the ISS to our crew on board to perform comm checks.
And SpaceX Dragon suit donning and audio config is complete for all 4 crew members.
And to provide status updates.
SpaceX copies 4.010 suit donning and audio config complete for all 4 crew members.
So that's particularly good news for mission control because one of the things that we have our astronauts do anytime we enter a dynamic phase of flight is put on those IVA suits. So when we talk about suit donning, they've been comfortable, right? Like we had those spacesuits on for liftoff, and hopefully we'll have some shots of liftoff from yesterday here for you in a moment. But we put those spacesuits on for liftoff, and then once we're safely in orbit, the astronauts can doff or take those suits off. But now that we're approaching the International Space Station, again, we're going to don the suits, put them back on, because we're moving into that dynamic phase of flight. So we're getting some confirmation there from our crew to mission control that we're moving forward in each of these careful steps, preparing both the capsule and the AX-4 crew for docking to the ISS.
And these are all good call-outs.
Yeah, great to hear. Yeah.
Perfect. I love it. We were talking about ingress just a moment ago. We'd love to show you shots of launch from yesterday. The teams at Kennedy Space Center, the SpaceX teams and the NASA teams, were able to get some great shots of this Falcon 9 and Dragon lifting off.
This was also the second liftoff and landing for our booster yesterday, so pretty exciting to see that flight-proven launch vehicle once again flying from 39A.
And there you have it, Grace taking to the air for the very first time.
That's a good point, Paul. This is our 5th and final Dragon in the fleet, which received its name yesterday from our commander, Peggy Whitson. Great shots of our crew there on their way up to space yesterday.
Flying with them was their zero-G indicator named Joy, and Joy has become a defining characteristic of this crew. As you saw there, the smiles and the joy on the faces of the crew members as they experienced launch, felt that acceleration, and then ultimately the lack of acceleration, the silence of microgravity at the end of all of that ascent. We then got to see them hours later on an on-orbit event as they were experiencing microgravity for the first time just a few hours ago.
Dragon, SpaceX
and here's a lovely moment.
Dragon to ground, ISS has completed their swap to the Bravo unit for C2V2. We're ready to try again for the big loop comm checks. If you could change your seat 2 destination back to ISS, and we'll give it another shot.
Inward.
So Joseph mentioned this earlier, but C2V2 stands for Common Communications for Visiting Vehicles. And what we're doing now is that final comm check as Dragon approaches the ISS to make sure that we're ready for our visiting vehicle.
Station on the big loop. We are very excited to have you loud and clear, Peggy.
And we are excited to hear your voice, and looking forward to seeing you guys shortly.
I can't wait to see you either, Peggy. Excited you guys are here.
And SpaceX copies Dragon loud and clear on the big loop.
And Houston copies SpaceX, ISS, and Dragon on the big loop.
And we have you loud and clear also, Houston.
So that was an awesome illustration of the big loop. You just heard astronauts on board the ISS talking to astronauts on board Dragon, confirmed by Mission Control here in Hawthorne, and then confirmed again by Mission Control in Houston. That is why they call it the big loop. We're literally going around the world. It's great.
We are. Everyone checking in, confirming that we're good, that we're ready to progress. And so obviously we'll continue to listen in, and hopefully that continues to call out what we need to hear to continue forward. So we were showing you shots of the crew inside the Dragon from earlier today. This is the 4 of them with their spacesuits off, as you mentioned. They doffed the spacesuits. This is in their other attire. And this was each of them taking a moment to speak to their country in their own language, as well as just acknowledge what it was like to see Earth
Dragon,
for the first time
SpaceX
out those
on the
windows.
big loop, you are go to begin your suit leak check procedure 4.011.
4.011 is in work.
So good news there that our crew is moving forward with additional checks on board. We're obviously working a lot of different procedures here too. You'll hear our team call out a series of different numbers. They're all carefully enumerated procedures that we step through to make sure that we don't miss anything in any of the steps it's going to take us to get to the ISF safely. Speaking of which, just in case you're just joining us, it would be good to go over many of the steps it took us to get to this point. Yesterday was launch day. Axiom-4 marks SpaceX's 18th human spaceflight launch overall. Including Axiom-4, Falcon 9 has supported 48 missions to the ISS with our Dragon spacecraft, starting with our first cargo resupply mission in 2012. And since 2022, SpaceX has supported the next generation.
SpaceX Dragon, we're at step 2.2, awaiting your go on suit leak check on the big loop.
We're moving through that suit leak check procedure now.
Dragon, SpaceX on the big loop, you are go to initiate suit leak check.
That's in work now.
Acknowledgement there from our commander. So SpaceX has supported the next generation of commercial space exploration so far with 7 private astronaut missions as of today, with today's AX-4 mission bringing the total to 4 missions to the space station in support of Axiom Space.
I love it. So AX-4 is Axiom Space's 4th mission to the International Space Station, as we've said. AX-1 was the first private crew to the International Space Station. AX-2 was known as the first private mission to feature government-sponsored astronauts, while as AX-3 was our first all-European astronaut mission to the International Space Station. And this mission realizes the return to human spaceflight for India, Poland, and Hungary. The efforts of India are conducted through the Indian Space Research Organization, or ISRO, while the efforts of Poland are as a member of the European Space Agency, or ESA. As a member of ESA, the Polish space agency, Polsa, has named this mission Ignis. For Hungary, this is a mission facilitated by HUNOR, which stands for Hungarian to Orbit Program. And this mission is the first mission to the space station for India, Poland, and Hungary. And after more than 40 years, this is each country's second government-sponsored human spaceflight ever. Missions like these are significant for a number of reasons. Each of these commercial missions builds on the last, but they facilitate a sizable amount of public and educational outreach. Medical research, intergovernmental relationships are built and fostered through these moments, and the list goes on. To be honest, there a lot of hard work goes into each of these missions to make sure that every minute is maximized. Ultimately, each one serves as a critical stepping stone on the path to providing global, sustained access to low Earth orbit.
Oh, absolutely. And at SpaceX, we want to help create a future where not just hundreds of people, but thousands and ultimately millions of people can travel off Earth to live and work in space and on other planets. It all starts with missions like these. It's hard to believe that it's been 5 years since Dragon radically changed how humanity gets to space, but I am very excited to see what this mission and all the ones to follow have in store. But with that, I do want to check back in with NASA at JSC. So Joseph, let's hand it back to you.
Thank you, Ronnie and Paul, and absolutely, yes, it's an incredible day to welcome the Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station, and I know we've already covered so many key milestones, including what it took to get to this point right now, and arrival day is always a busy one aboard the
loop, we see 4 good suit leak checks.
And right there, another great milestone. Another great milestone right there, 4 good suit leak checks. And we talked about that earlier about during the dynamic phases of flight, the crew puts those suits on to make sure that everything is safe and sound for them to provide that extra layer of protection as they continue to chase down the International Space Station. Now, from the space station perspective, here inside the International Space Station Flight Control Room at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, arrival day is always a busy one. And this morning, with no exception, NASA's astronauts Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers are already in position inside the cupola module, and they're using specialized software to keep track of Dragon's trajectory and confirm it remains inside its designated corridor. Now, the next key milestone that we're going to keep an eye on now is a course correction or a mid-course burn that's pretty much halfway between the AI burn, which went successfully a few moments ago, and then up to Waypoint Z, which is really going to start those key gates that the Dragon Grace spacecraft will start navigating on its way towards the International Space Station and docking to that zenith port, that space-facing port of the Harmony module. Now, once Dragon is docked, Nicole Ayers of NASA will be the first one to begin the hatch opening operations. She'll start by opening the large hatch on Node 2. That's that zenith space-facing port we were talking about, and that gives the crew access to the pressurized mating adapter. From there, they'll begin pressurizing what's called the vestibule. That's the small space in between the Dragon and the space station hatches. This area was exposed to the vacuum of space before docking, so it'll need to be filled with air to be equalized with both the pressure, both for the spacecraft and anyone inside the space station to equal out and for those to pass through. Ayers will then use a small valve on the station's hatch to gradually introduce air into that vestibule. And meanwhile, the flight controllers here in Houston will be closely monitoring the pressure readings to confirm that the seal is tight and everything is leak-free before giving the go for hatch opening. Now, here inside the International Space Station Flight Control Room, the controller is already hard at work. They've been doing so all morning long and well into since the launch, really, and beyond. NASA Flight Director Allison Bollinger and her Athena flight team are leading operations here in the International Space Station Flight Control Room in Mission Control. And then seated to my right, to their right is the Capcom, who you'll hear communicating to the teams on the International Space Station, a part of that big loop. You heard the comms checks multiple times between SpaceX, Dragon Grace, International Space Station, and the teams in Houston, so we're all on one single line of communication. Now, taking a look at who's aboard the International Space Station, we heard them mentioned a little bit earlier on, and currently aboard is the Expedition 73 crew members. And they are led by Commander Takuya Onishi, who is on that far right-hand side. And several members of this expedition crew have celebrated some key milestones for him. For Takuya, he celebrated 200 days in space about 2 weeks ago. Up next is NASA's Anne McClain. She is sitting right in front of Takuya on that right-hand side. She recently celebrated 300 days in orbit this past week. For Nicole Ayers, just on the other side of that Expedition 73 crew patch, she recently celebrated 100 days in space on Monday, and she and McClain are going to be the ones that are going to be monitoring the Axiom-4 team and Dragon Grace to the International Space Station. Then NASA's Johnny Kim, a flight engineer, he is on the back left-hand side of that image. Kirill Peskov of Roscosmos, a flight engineer, celebrated 100 days in space on Monday, and Sergei Ryzhikov, flight engineer, right there in the center. And then you have Alex Zubritsky, a flight engineer of Roscosmos as well. So flight controllers here in Houston have also begun the process of feathering the station's solar arrays and looking to get that multi-step procedure designed to protect the arrays from thruster plume exposure during Dragon's final approach. Now, taking a look at the updated timelines and what we're looking forward to, we're about 7 minutes away from that AI mid-course burn, and from there about 27 minutes from that Waypoint Z mark. And then from that point on, the space station and Dragon will continue to close the gap between each other. And then about 1 kilometer away will be the two vehicles, and that'll be in about 13 minutes from now. So again, a lot happening surrounding Dragon Grace and the Axiom-4 crew, as well as those aboard the International Space Station. We mentioned earlier that this will become a team of 11 that'll be joined together, and after docking, which right now is continuing to be adjusted, and working closer to about approximately 5:22 a.m. Central Time. And then we'll have the hatch opening, which we just walked through the procedures of having to equalize the pressure between Dragon and Space Station so those could pass through. And then we'll have the welcome remarks shortly thereafter. So still a lot of key milestones coming up for everyone on board. But to dive deeper into that that AI mid-course burn, again, that's about the halfway point from the AI burn to Waypoint 0, and that gives Dragon the ability to perform a mid-course maneuver, and that will give them to be about 400 meters or so below the International Space Station, and then of course will swing up and over top to then line itself up for Waypoint 0, which will be again to the zenith port of the International Space Station. And from there, Dragon will execute a small mid-course maneuver, and that's just to fine-tune its approach and bring it to about that 400-meter mark and get ready for the remainder of its gates and those checkpoints it has to come to for the International Space Station and Dragon to eventually meet up. Now, about 90 minutes ahead of docking, attitude control of the International Space Station will be handed over to the Russian thruster system, giving the station a finer point capability as Dragon closes in. We're looking forward to welcoming the Axiom Mission 4 astronauts aboard the International Space Station. Now, as we continue to get ready for that approach initiation burn, or that mid-course burn in about 5 minutes or so, we're going to continue to check in with our teams in Hawthorne and here on the ground in Houston. As you can see right there, the process that it took for Dragon to get to the International Space Station, starting about 45 minutes after launch yesterday with the phase burn, and then that stair-step approach to get to the front door of the International Space Station with those 5 key burns leading into the approach initiation. Now, all teams on board the International Space Station have been up and at it early this morning. We talked about the roles for Nicole Ayers as well as Ann McLean getting ready to welcome the Axiom Mission 4 team. You heard the great communications between the two already as they're eager and anxious to welcome Peggy Whitson, the former NASA astronaut and commander of Axiom Mission 4. She continues her record-setting mark as the most experienced astronaut, American astronaut in the history. Currently listening into the loops of here, the teams on the ground as they're getting ready to do a go, no-go for Waypoint 0 and Dragon's continued approach to the International Space Station.
We have no views, so you're going to have to keep tap dancing, and we don't have these loops in our broadcast, so you're pausing with no loops broadcast.
As we continue to follow along and continuing to tune in, we take momentary pauses just to listen into both the big loop of communications as well as the communications here in Houston and in SpaceX. As again, the team's pulling a go, no go for the International Space Station side of things to get ready for Dragon's arrival to the International Space Station. As I mentioned, once the mid-course maneuver is complete, it's then on to Waypoint 0 and getting them to that 400-meter mark. And hopefully we can take a look at a little bit of that graphic of what's to come for the Dragon Grace and the team aboard Axiom Mission 4. And you see there, Waypoint 0, about that 400-meter mark just outside the approach ellipsoid, that 400 kilometer by 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer invisible oval ellipsoid outside of the International Space Station, one of 2 imaginary boundaries that the Dragon will have to pass through, and then of course it'll make its way onto the Keepout sphere, and that's that 400-meter mark that we've been talking about, and that's where it's zeroing in on right now. So we've completed the approach initiation burn, which had them about 7 kilometers below the International Space Station, and now about 2 minutes and 45 seconds away from that mid-course burn, and we'll continue to track as Dragon and Grace continue to fine-tune itself and get ready to go and connect itself for the International Space Station. Now, of course, before Dragon is given permission to move inside the approach ellipsoid, the spacecraft configured to be known as what is a 24-hour safe trajectory. And this means that if Dragon were to lose control in its thrusters, it would be at least 24 hours before it could move inside the approach ellipsoid again. But again, those upcoming milestones, everything continuing to press on along as Dragon, so far so good, as it continues its chase down of the International Space Station. Now this maneuver continues
on the big loop. We are about 1,900 meters away and about 10 minutes out from having you jump into 1.102.
Great call outs there, as you heard the team saying about 1,900 meters away, that all that separates the Dragon and Grace spacecraft and the International Space Station. Now, as Paul and Ronnie have mentioned, that this is the fourth private astronaut mission, the first since January of 2024, and that was when Axiom Mission 3 would arrive aboard the orbiting laboratory. Now, from AX1 through AX4, once they are aboard, the teams will have welcomed 14
Houston,
different...
copies, 10 minutes. Houston Station, copy 10 minutes until step one of the procedure.
And continuing to track about now 55 seconds away from that AI mid-course burn, and was saying from AX1 through AX4, the International Space Station will have welcomed 14 different private astronaut crew members representing 11 different nations, and showcasing again how private astronaut missions truly expand access to the space station for more nations, people, and opportunities. And we'll continue to tune into all of the loops here inside of the International Space Station flight control room as we await the AI mid-course burn. And now standing about 20 seconds away as it continues to fine-tune. Dragon Grace continues to fine-tune its path towards the International Space Station. And we just received confirmation that the AI mid-course burn is now in progress. And again, this is done about halfway from our starting point, which was the approach initiation burn, and that'll get Dragon on its path towards Waypoint 0. It's just a small burn, but again, all about fine-tuning and its approach to ensure that we're targeting a precise point of about 400 meters directly below the International Space Station. As you can see on your screen, the team on the right-hand side is those working and monitoring the AI mid-course burn, as well as the teams on the left. On the right, that is the International Space Station Mission Control Room here in Houston, Texas. And on the left-hand side, the SpaceX teams and their Mission Control Room in Hawthorne, California, as we continue to follow along with the AI mid-course burn, now a little over a minute and 20 seconds in. And mid-course burn has just been completed, and everything has been reported as nominal.
Dragon, SpaceX on the big loop, mid-course maneuver complete. Performance was nominal. The trajectory has converged on Waypoint 0.
So great news there.
And Dragon copies on the big loop.
And confirmation from Dragon Grace, and you heard Commander Peggy Whitson relaying down to the ground. And now the next milestone that we're zeroing in on is Waypoint 0, which will be about 18.5 minutes from now. Is that slow but methodical approach for Dragon Grace and the Axiom Mission 4 team continues to make its way towards the International Space Station. And with that, we'll check back in with Ronnie and Paul back in Hawthorne.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Joseph. I'm loving all of these check-ins that we're getting about Dragon's progress on its way to station, how the crew is doing, hearing these call-outs from the nets. But I'm getting really spoiled today because you had great stories about the crew while we were here in kind of like our pre-show warm-up. And I would love to hear a little bit more about how you followed along the AX4 crew in like the 10 months leading up to this.
Absolutely.
And really like followed their preparations and everything that brought the crew to today.
Certainly. And so there's obviously a large team that facilitates all of the operational training flow and helping prepare them for this moment. We have a unique opportunity to document that and follow that story with them quite literally around the world over the course of all of that training. And I think it's just interesting as you get to know each of the crew members, just to understand, like, in the midst of all of this operation, in the midst of all of the timing and the coordination, there's still 4 humans inside Dragon, each with their own personalities, each with their own ambitions and characteristics, and they add to what becomes the mission.
in the crew, right?
Exactly.
Like they become one crew, which is
Absolutely.
AX4. Yeah.
Absolutely. So Peggy, I would argue, is a consummate leader. I mean, if you know anything about her, you likely know she has record after record of human spaceflight, and it is. And here we are actually seeing some views of the ISS, of the International Space Station, from Dragon. And yet, as I was saying, with Peggy, if you know her, she obviously has all of these records for human spaceflight, and it's certainly not a surprise at all that she is an inductee into the 2025 Astronaut Hall of Fame. And yet, if you get a chance to get to know her, you quickly realize she's not just about those individual accolades. She is about the team and team efforts. She wants to build teams and take them to space. And so certainly we've had the honor of following her around the world, preparing for 2 Axiom space missions, both AX2 and now AX4. And it is remarkable how she commands every room she walks in without taking over. She just exudes this steady confidence that people respond to.
Speaking of how she is commanding the capsule, we just had a great shot of her inside of the Dragon spacecraft, looking up at those touchscreen displays. And so we're going to keep bringing you views like the one we have on your screen right now of the International Space Station whenever we have ground station coverage. When we have good views, we'll obviously share them with you. This one is particularly cool because we're watching the International Space Station come into focus through a camera that is under Dragon's nose cone. So right after we got through launch and orbital insertion yesterday, we deployed the nose cone and exposed those docking hooks that we're going to use for the hard capture.
Station Houston on the Big Loop. Dragon range is approximately 1,000 meters. Monitor long-range approach per steps 1 to 4 in 1.102. Dragon approach and retreat monitoring. ISS crew is now primed for vehicle approach monitoring.
More of those joint communications on the Big Loop there about that approach that we're watching on our screen right now. It's pretty cool.
Absolutely. And it looks as though Dragon is currently underneath the International Space Station. We're looking almost up at it from underneath.
Yeah, and we had those great graphics earlier that showed how we're balancing this really careful geometry and approaching each step with these methodical burns. Acknowledgement from our commander there. So we're stepping through each of these really methodical burns of those Draco thrusters on board Dragon. There are 16 of those thrusters around the spacecraft, and we use them for these careful, fine-tuned maneuvering once we get to orbit. So right now on our screen, we've got our commander, Peggy Whitson, and our pilot, Shubhanshu Shukla. And you got a chance to chat with Shooks in the lead up to this launch too, right?
Absolutely. He is such a unique, quiet force. He is witty and smart, and I tell you, 3 steps ahead of any given moment, and you don't even realize it. He's already there. He has said that his career is defined by simply saying yes, which I thought was so interesting and powerful and simple. I mean, effectively, he was saying that every opportunity, whether it was to get a chance to learn to fly or join the military or even pursue this mission, he simply said yes. And in doing so, he walked through the door and made the most of it. No matter what he's faced alongside this crew, from days of poor weather out at the Knowles expedition, which is the National Outdoor Leadership School, to processing kind of the immense volume of procedures that must be taken on and understood across all of the myriad of procedures that one must understand and become proficient on for this kind of a space flight. In the midst of all of that, he has remained calm and collected, and quite honestly, just made it look easy. And what's more, he has this unwavering spirit about him that just invites everyone around him to step up and into their roles effectively.
It's awesome to hear these stories about the way this crew really came together and everything that brought them to the mission today. For those of you who are just joining us, we have some great graphics along the base of your screen to help you follow along the mission the same way that we have been eagerly following it for the last several weeks, really, in the lead up to today. So along the bottom left-hand corner, we've got some telemetry on where our Dragon spacecraft is, including its speed and altitude. And then on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you actually see our location around the Earth. And that rightmost corner is the firing of those Draco thrusters on board. And right now we're getting great views from inside the spacecraft of our crew working with those touchscreen displays, stepping through these checklists. And now we're getting our first views from station looking down at Dragon, which is always my favorite moment of docking.
Absolutely.
Because you know that the astronauts on board the International Space Station we heard it in their voices earlier,
Yes.
are excited for this crew to be on board.
It's also one of the few moments where you really get a sense of the speed and the scale of all of this operation, right? Seeing the Earth just roll behind with those clouds, you suddenly get a sense of perspective that is just unlike anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we're doing here and why we're moving so carefully through each of these maneuvers is that, as you've noted here, these spacecraft, both the International Space Station and Dragon, are still moving really fast. So we need them to approach each other with a relative speed that's very gentle so that that docking is smooth and steady, just the way that we intend it to be. But we're still moving like 17,500 miles per hour, lapping the Earth every 90 minutes. So this is a very high speed but careful maneuver to make sure that we get our entire crew safely aboard the International Space Station.
Absolutely intricate, methodical, one step at a time.
There you go. Speaking of people who are particularly methodical, you were mentioning that Swavush is like very deliberate in his actions and his lead up to everything with the crew earlier.
Swav, yes, as we like to call him, Swavush Uznansky-Wisniewski, is quite a lot to say. So they've quite poignantly call him Swav. He is brilliant, and I tell you, but more specifically,
Dragon, SpaceX on the big loop.
I'll pause here.
Ground is go for approach 0. Burn is enabled. Maneuver start time is 9:34 Zulu. As a reminder, Dragon will nominally continue approach through Waypoint 1 toward Waypoint 2 without stopping at Waypoint 1.
And there we have
And
another.
Dragon copies all, and we're go for the approach as well.
Another call out between Core and our commander, acknowledged by Commander Peggy Whitson.
And that was a cool call out too, because we told the crew that we're going to move right through Waypoint 1. Each of those waypoints are an opportunity for us to pause and make sure that everything's going well. So that means that everything's really going on track, right? We're ready to move into this next process of approaching the station.
So we were talking about Swav, and just to finish that thought, I have often described him as somebody who is brilliant, but more specifically, he is curious. Swavush is certainly one who is genuinely in pursuit of knowledge and understanding. I've actually never seen him to shy away from asking the next question. Throughout all the training, you can expect him to raise a hand and lean in, and everyone else does as a result. I mean, you just kind of get pulled into that earnest pursuit of knowledge, and he wraps it all up in a pretty good charm. He's exciting to learn beside. You know, I for one found myself wanting to lean in and learn alongside him as an outsider here. But his curiosity is probably matched only by his love for exploration and being out in the unknown. Like from sailing to hiking to kind of peering over that next ridge, he is one who is constantly seeking and experiencing something new. He has a love for this life and for this planet that is infectious. One can only imagine how that perspective is growing as he's looking out the window and seeing the Earth and perhaps even maybe the ISS at this point outside Dragon.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, speaking of his love of something new, 3 of the crew members that we have on board AX-4 are first-time flyers to low Earth orbit and to the International Space Station. So very excited to hear their take on both being up there and then everything they have to share with all of us once they return. So with that, can we round out some stories here for our 4th crew member?
Absolutely. So Tibor, he is an incredible thinker. You can just see him process any information and immediately then begin to put it to use. He is someone who just grabs and goes. But also, even more than that, he's someone who really feels things deeply. He cares about what this mission is. He cares about what it means for all those back home in Hungary. He's got a very high emotional intelligence, I would say. He can read the room in an instant. But I tell you, his gift to humanity is to then be able to elevate and brighten everyone around him. I don't know of a single instructor, maybe ops team member, or even medical support staffer who doesn't smile when they think of Tibor Kapu. And I also tell you, he is tireless. There is quite a lot that he is capable of and responsible for, and that is invigorating to just see him approach every step of everything he's asked to do with diligence.
And there were a lot of steps in the lead up to this for our crew. Astronaut preparation is extensive, from training that's specific to each crew member's role to learning SpaceX protocols, space station systems, and preparing for the science and outreach activities they'll be conducting in space. Private astronaut training is pretty rigorous. So in addition to the work that they did in the field, like you mentioned with the National Outdoor Leadership School, or NOLS.
Station Houston on the Big Loop. First step, 1 of 1.102. Can you please confirm Dragon is in sight and give us an attitude assessment?
So we are standing by for that update there on the attitude of the spacecraft. Attitude, when we're talking about space travel, means the position of the spacecraft. So with that, I do want to bring it back to the training, because this crew on board AX-4 spent 35 days training inside Dragon. To prepare them for flight, our teams at SpaceX spent the last several months teaching the crew about orbital mechanics and how to live inside the Dragon spacecraft. Well, this was more of a review for Peggy Whitson. For the rest of the crew, as we mentioned, this is their first time flying to space. Our training program includes nearly 100 different lessons covering all aspects of the flight. The crew spent time inside our Dragon training spacecraft to run simulations of ascent, space station rendezvous, which we are doing right now, and reentry. And they also spent time at the launch pad in our suit-up room and working through emergency procedures that would be necessary in the unlikely event of a pad abort.
And in addition to the critical training from SpaceX associated with...
on the Big Loop, come check.
Houston reads you loud and clear.
And as we were saying, in addition to the critical training from SpaceX associated with all of these dynamic phases of ascent and return, Axiom Space has facilitated a host of training efforts since August over these last 10 months to ensure that the crew and all of those who support them are ready
Station
for this
Houston on
mission.
the Big Loop. We did not copy your last.
Station on the Big Loop. We have Dragon in sight, and attitude looks nominal.
Houston copies. That's a good report.
That is a great report. It's always nice to hear those confirmations, especially across the Big Loop, because we are coordinating so many teams for missions like this.
Absolutely. Looking at the graphics at the bottom of the screen, you can see where Dragon is over the Earth. And from my vantage point, I believe that is just east of Africa.
I think one of the things that's the most striking to me is that as we watch all these different visuals come into play, which again, we are bringing you whenever we have them. So when we've got good views, we're sharing them with you. We're really seeing how quickly Dragon is approaching the station.
At 429 kilometers above the Earth, they are continuing to raise that elevation, that altitude, and get closer and closer to where they'll be working and living for the next 2 weeks. But again, these visuals just tell an amazing story of where we're going and what we're doing, where low Earth orbit is. It is hard to really comprehend and wrap your mind around the idea of living off planet, and yet visuals like this start to help you make that real.
Oh, absolutely. And hearing commentary like we did earlier from that on-orbit check-in, it was great to hear how quickly even the crew was saying they were learning how to do things in microgravity, especially because we have so many first-time flyers on this mission. Hopefully, first time but not the last. We have a repeat with our commander, Peggy Whitson, as well.
Absolutely. A little bit of joy goes a long way. and overcoming some of those probably initial sensations and adjusting to microgravity. Shubhanshu had mentioned that it was taking a minute to kind of collect himself and find his space legs, but clearly they are all in good spirits and getting ready to get very active on board the International Space Station.
Which I'm sure will also be like an acclimation process, right?
Absolutely.
They've gotten used to Dragon. They've been in flight now for more than a day. All told, from launch to rendezvous at the station, we're looking at about a 28-hour flight. The time is somewhat dependent on the relative position of the International Space Station to our launch site at the time that we launch. But for any time that we're rendezvousing or meeting two spacecraft in orbit, we do have an instantaneous launch window. So we know how long that trip is going to be at the moment that we lift off. And the entire crew operations plan is built around filling that time effectively so that they're well acclimated on board the Dragon spacecraft while they approach the International Space Station. But then as soon as they get on board, we'll do our welcome ceremony. And I'm sure there's an orientation for them as well.
Absolutely.
So they have an effective 2 weeks while they're up there.
And the clock starts as soon as they get on board, right? You just mentioned the welcome ceremony. So there will be a moment once they've crossed the hatch and are officially on the International Space Station where they get to meet the other expedition crew members, have a moment to meet and greet, acknowledge the moment with a little bit of ceremony and tradition. There might even be some pinning of astronaut pins to go around. But then they get right to work. Certainly, I know that there are steps where they take to just kind of acclimate to the station, where the commander is going to take them around and make sure that they're clear on roles and responsibilities. But then again, the red line begins, and they are chasing it for the next 2 weeks, trying to accomplish a host of research efforts and outreach events. It's a full couple of weeks ahead of them.
We also have a full couple of hours here ahead of us before we get to that part.
Yes.
We are less than a minute away from approaching Waypoint 0. So I do want to check back in with NASA. Joseph, why don't you give us an update on where our spacecraft is relative to the ISS?
Thank you very much, Ronnie and Paul, as we here in the teams at the International Space Station Flight Control Room tracking the arrival to Waypoint 0 for Dragon Grace and the Axiom Mission 4 team, which they have just now hit that mark, which means approximately 400 meters directly below the station. And we can see those wonderful views now, and you can really see that high resolution of Dragon Grace continuing its methodical approach to the International Space Station. We're still tracking a docking time of about 5:18 a.m. Central Time, 6:18 a.m. Eastern. And you mentioned the hatch opening, and then as well as the welcome remarks shortly to follow. Hatch opening roughly about 2 hours or so after the initial contact and capture. And then when the hooks drive, the 12 hooks that are on the bulkhead there of the SpaceX Dragon will connect itself and create that hard mate, sealing itself to the orbiting laboratory. And once the pressure checks and seals will be done, then everything will be pressurized and ready to go. So Waypoint 0 has been achieved, and now they're making their way on to Waypoint 1. But you heard earlier on the loops that they have received the go to proceed past Waypoint 1 and head straight on to Waypoint 2. And that means they'll continue to swing up and above the International Space Station, and then what would have been a pause at the 220-meter mark, they'll continue to press forward and look to get to about Waypoint 2. And Waypoint 2's arrival will be just right on the doorstep of the International Space Station,
Dragon,
about 20
SpaceX
meters away.
On the big loop, approach 0 has started, and the trajectory has converged on Waypoint 1. Expect arrival at Waypoint 1 at 10:09 Zulu.
Expecting arrival at Waypoint 1 at 10:09 Zulu.
And there you heard it right there, that they are continuing to move on along and get ready to approach what would be Waypoint 1, which that milestone will be in about a little less than 40 minutes from now. As you see right there on your screen, the Dragon Grace spacecraft continuing its methodical approach to the International Space Station. And of course, the 7 members aboard Space Station right now, looking forward to welcoming Commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubhanshu Shukla, as well as mission specialists Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Tibor Kapu to the orbiting laboratory. And a welcome back to Commander Peggy Whitson. This will be her fifth time in her fifth space flight. All of her space flights, what are the previous three with NASA and now two with Axiom Space, all key components and key missions involving the International Space Station. And you also heard on the Big Loop confirmations from Nicole Ayers and Anne McLean, who are monitoring Dragon's approach. They are in the cupola. That is the famed window to the world from the International Space Station that you see so many stellar views from many astronauts that share their experiences from the cupola. That is where they're using special technology to monitor and make sure that the Dragon spacecraft stays in the exact corridor, and that makes sure that everything is remaining on track and stays in its expected zones. Now, as we continue to march towards Waypoint 1, and again, they will bypass Waypoint 1 unless they need to make that pit stop to make sure everything is fine-tuned and ready. Once Dragon continues through Waypoint 1, Waypoint 2, and then eventual capture, Nicole Ayers will be the primed NASA astronaut to start the hatch opening process. And that'll begin by opening the large hatch on the Node 2 Zenith port. That is the port facing outer space, and that gives them access to the pressurized mating adapter. And there, Ayers and McLean and company will then move in and make sure that everything is sealed up once checks have been done and the relative dampening motion has been removed between Dragon and its connection to the International Space Station. And Ayers will pressurize the vestibule, and that is the small space between the hatches of the Dragon spacecraft and the space station. Now, that vestibule has been exposed to the vacuum of space, and that was all due to prior to docking. So the crew will need to fill it with air to make sure its pressure is nearly equal with the atmospheric pressure on Dragon and in the station. That pressure, similar to what we experience here on Earth at sea level, about 14 psi is what they need to bring it up to, again, from the vacuum of space. And that's where Ayers will use a small valve on that station's hatch to slowly introduce the air into the vestibule, and flight controllers here in Houston will monitor and verify that pressure readings, and everything is making sure to be leak-free before we get ready to open up the hatches. As you can see, Space Dragon Grace making its way with the nose cone open, and you can see that strobe in the middle. And it's always fascinating to watch. Now during an orbital daytime, you can see the sun shining brightly on the spacecraft and the thrusters firing, and you can follow along in that bottom right-hand corner which thrusters are being activated again to fine-tune Dragon's path to the International Space Station. But seeing that strobe, always fun when it illuminates from the Dragon perspective on the International Space Station, and we may get some of those great views closer to docking. And again, that docking time tracking closer to 5:18 a.m. Central Time, 6:18 a.m. Eastern, and that is where the soft capture will connect, and then the hooks will drive. The 12 hooks in two sets of 6 will drive and form the hard mate and bring Dragon and the space station closer together before the leak checks, the umbilicals for communication and power. Everything will be connected, and then the pressurization of that vestibule from NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers and team will begin. About 36 minutes from now, Dragon spacecraft will reach its Waypoint 1 mark. And again, that's where the spacecraft will swing up and above the International Space Station, as it'll be docking to the space-facing or zenith port of the Harmony module. You can see great views
Houston
again
station
of
on the
Dragon.
Big Loop per block Bravo. Dragon attitude is as expected.
Houston copies. Thank you.
Great communications there. Is everything going to plan for Dragon Grace? And you can see those thruster firings, those plumes of gases that are helping the spacecraft navigate its way from Waypoint 0 to Waypoint 1, and as mentioned, it's going to go up and over top of the International Space Station and then align itself to that zenith port, and then it'll make its way onto Waypoint 2. As mentioned previously, all visiting vehicles that arrive to the International Space Station take this phased approach when going to the orbiting laboratory, stopping at those predetermined gates. And that's for teams here on the ground, both in SpaceX and in Houston, to run quick checks on vehicle performance before approaching the laboratory. And there you can see that strobe effect that we were talking about just a moment ago as it illuminates the views from the International Space Station looking at the Dragon Grace spacecraft as it continues its methodical approach to the station, as they are now just in the southernmost regions of Australia and making its way into the Pacific Ocean. Both Dragon and station just began an orbital nighttime period, so we'll continue to lean on that strobe effect on the spacecraft to follow along. As Slow and Steady continues to win the race for these docking operations between Dragon and the International Space Station, and of course always requires a great deal of precision to make sure that we're keeping the spacecraft and the crew safe. And there's a great look inside of Dragon Grace, and then the view from the spacecraft now looking to the International Space Station, and those slight glimpses of daylight left before both the orbiting laboratory and the spacecraft completely enveloped in darkness during the orbital nighttime period. You can see the radiators. That's what's most prominent in the view of the International Space Station. And at the very top of this view of the International Space Station, you can see what was Dragon Endurance. That is the Dragon spacecraft vehicle that Crew 10 took to the International Space Station back in March. So upon docking, and once everyone is settled, you will see the International Space Station flying with both Grace and Endurance, and 5 total vehicles connected to the orbiting lab. View inside of the Dragon spacecraft, and you see from just over the shoulder of Peggy Whitson and Shubhanshu Shukla, the commander and pilot, as they are continuing to monitor the progress of the spacecraft. And there, the final faint views of the International Space Station before the orbital nighttime period. And as mentioned, these two chasing each other just off the southeast coast of Australia as we speak. And a great view of that center screen there, where you're seeing Dragon lining itself up with the International Space Station, and the views that both pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO and Peggy Whitson, commander of Axiom-4, are monitoring. Now approaching about 31 minutes until we reach Waypoint 1. And once the spacecraft reaches Waypoint 1, it'll be about 220 meters away, a little more than 656 feet from the orbiting laboratory, as Dragon Grace on its inaugural flight, looking to connect up to the International Space Station. Before we reach Waypoint 1, which will be in about 30 minutes from now, the teams here on the ground, about 10 minutes outside of that milestone, will conduct a go, no-go poll, which we've been talking about throughout today's broadcast, just that step-by-step process, that slow and steady methodical maneuvering of the spacecraft to connect to the orbiting laboratory. And we're continuing to follow along for an approximate docking time of 5:18 a.m. Central Time, 6:18 a.m. Eastern. And the only light you're seeing from that shot was bouncing off of the International Space Station and what it provided, but now inside Dragon Grace and its Axiom Mission 4 crew of Peggy Whitson, commander, Shubhanshu Shukla, pilot. That's who you see in the field of view there, just that over-the-shoulder shot as they monitor Dragon's maneuvering towards the space station, but also joined alongside by mission specialist Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski and Tibor Kapu, respectively, of ESA and Hunor. And as we continue to take a look at the orbital nighttime phasing of the International Space Station and the Dragon Grace spacecraft, you see those thruster firings continuing that methodical approach for the craft, but you can also see in that left-hand side the speed of which they are traveling, the Dragon spacecraft at that, as it makes, again, it's starting to steady out and that slow push towards the orbiting laboratory, 428 kilometers above Earth. Once aboard the orbiting laboratory, the Axiom Mission 4 crew will participate in about 60 research investigations representing 31 countries, and more than 24 of those experiments supported by the ISS National Laboratory. And there's a live look at the teams here on the ground on the left-hand side. That is Mission Control in SpaceX, Hawthorne, California, following along with Dragon's progress, I should say. And on the right-hand side, it looks to be Axiom Space here in Houston, just down the road from Johnson Space Center, NASA's Johnson Space Center, where we are located. And the International Space Station Flight Control Room, all three teams working together in integrated operations. That began just before we went live for today's broadcast. We're all three monitoring the progress of the Dragon spacecraft to the International Space Station. And you've been hearing communications on what is the big loop, which is that single line of comms that allow for the Dragon spacecraft and Grace to communicate with the International Space Station, but also for the teams on the ground here in Houston and in California and Hawthorne, all to communicate together. So everybody on the same page as the spacecraft continues its push towards the orbiting lab. We are about 26 minutes away, a little bit north of that, until we reach Waypoint 1 for Dragon Grace. As you can see, some of that telemetry and data populating the screens inside of the spacecraft that the team on board are carefully monitoring. And this is the view from the Dragon spacecraft looking up at the International Space Station, as these two now making their way into the southernmost regions of the Pacific Ocean, having just passed underneath the south and then the southeast of Australia. They will continue into an orbital nighttime period until they reach roughly about the east coast of North America, and then you'll get some of those great views of the sunlight radiating over top of both of the craft. So far, everything performing nominally for the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft as it continues its push towards the International Space Station, and what's been quite the journey for them. You heard earlier that this, since launch all the way up to the anticipated docking time, will be about a 28-hour process, 28, 29 hours or so. So a lot has happened in a short amount of time as the teams in Hawthorne, California on the left and the teams on the right-hand side in Axiom Space working together with those here in Houston. And those teams right now communicating with each other on those internal communications loops that we monitor and follow along with as they now prepare the teams for Waypoint 1 about 24 minutes from now. The go no go for that will be in about 15 minutes or so. And we'll keep an ear out for those comms as, again, Dragon starting to slow down its approach towards the International Space Station, a very methodical journey that all started shortly after launch, what was yesterday morning at 1:31 a.m. Central Time, 2:31 a.m. Eastern. That saw the Axiom Mission 4 team reach orbit and begin its journey to track down the International Space Station, the fourth private astronaut mission and the first since January of 2024, when Axiom Mission 3 would join the expedition aboard the orbiting laboratory. On board the International Space Station, the crews, they were up and got right into preparing for Dragon's arrival. NASA's Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, who you've heard at times on the big communications loop talking to all parties. They are in the station's cupola using specialized software to track Dragon's approach and making sure it stays in the expected zones with that orbital nighttime currently enveloping the station and the Dragon spacecraft. They're keeping a close eye, and of course from the space station perspective, and we'll see it as we receive video communication, that strobing effect, that strobe light on the front, and that forward nose cone of the SpaceX Dragon to help illuminate its path and help keep track. Earlier, we also received that as the Dragon spacecraft makes its way towards Waypoint 1 about 22 minutes from now, that the teams on the ground were looking to bypass this milestone, but will again do a go, no go poll, make sure everything looks exactly as it should before allowing that bypass of the spacecraft, and then its maneuver up and over top of the International Space Station, and then proceeding onto Waypoint 2. And a great graphic of the International Space Station, and just below it, the Dragon spacecraft is, again, they are making their journey across the Pacific Ocean, traveling over 26,000 kilometers an hour and 420 plus kilometers above the Earth's surface.